I am, by trade, a construction worker, though I haven't constructed anything in over a year, and it remains to be seen if I will construct anything ever again, given the current atmosphere in the place where I live. Whilst reflecting recently on this long hiatus from professional life, I was struck by memories from a previous time, memories that went some way to demystifying how a culture that shouts so loudly about liberty and individualism could fall into such abject submission. In the process of this thinking, I realised that I had been through all of this before, and that despite my own self-image, as a rugged and self-reliant individual, had ultimately capitulated to the same forces. Manual work is tiring. When one is tired, one makes mistakes. I myself have been out of work for extended periods after various accidents. Without fail, these situations occurred when I was rushing, distracted, or otherwise not in control of my emotions. Unfortunately, I've been on jobs where people have suffered serious and even life-changing injuries. These things almost always happen via a mental lapse of one sort or another. What I took from all this is that one is ultimately responsible for one's own safety, regardless of any official protocols in place. That by taking an extreme approach to personal responsibility, one can operate at a higher level, exuding almost an aura of hyper-awareness and control that makes one precognizant of risk, something akin to the much sought-after flow state. I thus, over time, changed from an extremely carefree and risk-inclined youngster to a much sharper adult who wore his boots and knee pads, even when he didn't have to, even when it was hot. I was inspired to adopt this attitude by the best around me. Such a stance requires an enormous amount of discipline, and one would always falter from time to time. We would raise each other's morale when the going got tough, and challenge each other to improve the quality of every aspect of our work. It was an invigorating, dignified and fulfilling way to go about one's business, a proactive approach to the inherent perils of the job. I imagine that most people hearing this would like to believe that they fulfill this archetype. I hope I did more than I didn't. Everyone states a preference for this vision, because everyone is a hero over a few beers after work. This is, I believe, a genuine sentiment, but in my experience, the revealed preference is quite different, because conformity is an equally powerful impulse which can be more easily manipulated by weak leaders. Collectively, the industry has reached a conclusion which is the exact opposite of mine. No one can be trusted to think for themselves, and everything must be controlled to an infinitesimal degree of tedium. We had impossible zero-harm policies long before the quest for zero COVID. This lowest common denominator approach drains all initiative out of the workforce. They become passive and conformist towards a system of management which is affected by the same malaise. The shifting of responsibility becomes a primary skill. A belief pervades that if something goes wrong, it will be someone else's fault. This disassociation from danger induces carelessness and ensures that accidents are never truly eradicated. The ubiquity of smartphones renders planning an arcane art. Why think ahead when you can perpetually react? Everyone is constantly anxious and distracted as a result, always low on battery, waiting for the next problem or last-minute change to arrive. This is not good when operating at height with power tools or around HGVs. You can no longer trust that the man footing your ladder is paying attention. Perversely, in this way, mental acuity is actively eroded. The loss of internal discipline means that rules are constantly broken. Previously unthinkable accidents happen. Passivity and inefficiency become normalised. Absurdly, this is seen as evidence that the process must become even more controlled. Much like the lockdowns, the inherent truth of the health and safety doctrine is presupposed. Successes are attributed to it, failures are externalised. In both circumstances, the conclusion is that there must be more of it. A Kafkaesque drama results, in which the protagonists are left with no power, someone else's responsibility, and most of the same risks as before. Interactions between workers turn away from expressions of collective endeavour and towards bizarre manifestations of bureaucratic logic. We obsess over what we are allowed to do and think little of what we ought to do. For example, after a number of close calls with various forms of shrapnel, I quietly took to wearing safety glasses, even though they were not yet mandated where I worked. Amongst those of a more old-school disposition, this was deemed virtuous and prudent, a healthy decision aimed at securing one's future. Others didn't see it that way. Why, they would ask, are you doing that? You know you don't have to. To my surprise, this represented the overwhelming majority of opinion, even amongst health and safety inspectors. I had decided that the very minor discomfort and inconvenience of the glasses was worth the massive reduction in risk of blindness. What I hadn't factored in was the cost of having to explain something so basic and obvious every 5 minutes. Or the mental energy spent deflecting ridicule from pre-diabetics with cigarettes hanging out of their mouths. In a one-on-one conversation, these people would tend to agree with me, but in a group they would revert back to whatever the loudest critic was saying. These skeptics represent the converse to my pro-responsibility position. For them, one should do precisely what one is told, nothing more, nothing less. These people would insist I donned a high-vis in a room on my own, or a hard hat whilst working in an office block with women in high heels 10 feet away, but laugh at me for choosing to wear safety glasses. Theirs was an entirely conformist approach. No doubt most of them are doctrinaire mask advocates today, purely out of social pressure, rather than any internal consideration. Many are surely exempt due to their own self-induced obesity, demanding extraordinary sacrifices from others to protect their own long-neglected well-being. And now that health and safety has gone viral, we can all experience the inherent contradictions of this passive and disappointing approach to life, which strips us of our autonomy whilst continuing to blame us when things go wrong. It is worth noting here for those in other lines of work that health and safety is a somewhat flexible concept, in my experience designed to protect primarily those whose exposure is financial, and secondarily those whose exposure is physical. I was once employed to build a suspended structure which was to be in place for a short period of time. The drawings for the structure were unusual, and upon completion I decided that it was not sound. I could see that it possessed an unacceptably high chance of failure. In such an event, I wouldn't want to be standing underneath it. Unfortunately, the person for whom I was working had proven himself to be untrustworthy, incompetent, and adept at shifting blame. And it was obvious to me that recommending that the structure be dismantled would do me no favours at all. Even if I could convince him to go ahead, my actions would be interpreted as a betrayal. It was well known that this was a critical moment in the build, and it would have been unbelievably expensive to change anything. With this in mind, I hatched a plan to anonymously report myself to the health and safety inspector, a clipboard operator of renowned pedantry who would gleefully threaten lesser minions with the sack for failure to display the high visibility tunic, something of a precursor for today's mask regime. On this occasion, to my amazement, he refused to condemn the structure. He in fact became quite agitated and in a lengthy monologue argued himself into leaving it up. He was seething. I had forced his hand in such a way that it would have to be turned on the men who paid his salary rather than the few below him. In the end, he consoled himself with the existence of insurance. The prospect of deploying his power upwards instantly dissolved his characteristic zeal. As I lay in bed that night, I felt sick because I knew that my ostensibly noble action was only the result of my ability to manipulate the situation in such a way as to excuse myself from true responsibility. I could have unilaterally informed the employer that the structure was unsound, dismantled the thing myself, and not left it up to the health and safety inspector to act with integrity. Goodness knows how he felt. Though I did more than anybody else, it was because I knew that I would face no adverse consequences. I had already absconded from that responsibility. Anyone to whom I have ever told this story is obviously outraged. What is actually shocking, and what goes unsaid, is that this is entirely normal, and not just in my world. Would I have acted any differently in the health and safety inspector's position? Ultimately, everyone found their own way to pass the buck and no one died. Another successful day at the office. The lower down the food chain one is, the more one is forced to fulfill every tiny detail of the code. Simultaneously, at the bottom, one is tacitly expected to conform to a parallel and contradictory system of social pressure, which entails getting the job done via methods unacceptable to the health and safety apparatchiks, in order to spare the employer the inconvenience of having to rectify the consequences of his own poor planning. He would much rather it was your body on the line than his profit margin. This would not be a problem if we were truly free to engage in a negotiation about precisely how much this exposure to danger was going to cost, either individually or as a collective, But of course, this is not allowed. Such a conversation would entail reason, responsibility, and courage. These concepts are anathema to health and safety, as they render its inspectors obsolete, and bureaucracy persists because it's good at producing more of itself, not less. Instead, the site rules always say, everyone is responsible for health and safety. I couldn't agree more with this statement, except that in reality what it means is, follow these rules, no matter how stupid they are. Don't do anything different, no matter how sensible it is. Initiative and innovation are banned. The only way to differentiate yourself from the crowd is via a willingness to break the rules, something one is basically forced to do because the rules are so often obstructive. Afterwards, if one resists a particular command on legitimate grounds, an employer will always remind him that he broke the rules in the past. If one gets hurt, he will have to weigh the value of a claim against the cost to the professional relationship. I've seen this happen over and over again. Any tiny infraction, regardless of relevance, will be used against him, affecting his compensation. Inevitably, a health and safety crackdown will follow. From the bottom up, we capitulate and end up engaging in excessive risk-taking, not because we want to, but in a desperate scrabble against each other to secure employment. This is massively accentuated by the influx of migrant workers, as well as having a downward effect on wages. Factoring in inflation and an industry-wide reduction in rates, my own pay has dropped by 40% in real terms in the last decade. Migrant workers will do anything, as I've heard several bosses say. As the least secure of all, they are much less likely to refuse a dangerous order, well aware of their replaceability. Thus, the pressure increases on native workers to do the same. It becomes normal to accept responsibility for breaking the rules at someone else's command, for nothing more than continued employment. From the top down, we capitulate to health and safety overreach, as every aspect of work becomes more tedious and bureaucratic. This is supposed to be the solution to the previous problem, but in reality represents a devastating transfer of dignity away from the man who actually wields the tools, and who is no longer allowed to determine for himself what is a good or bad idea. In giving up our sense of responsibility and subordinating ourselves to someone else's assessment of risk, we have lost a considerable portion of our power. We will never get this back as long as the zero harm regime stands, and we will find ourselves jumping through more and more hoops for the clipboard operators, the justification of whose existence rests entirely on the ability to unearth further vectors of harm reduction, each of which comes with a corresponding loss of autonomy and remuneration for the man doing the actual work. They stand like scowling puppeteers behind us. I once turned around to see 9 of them, all watching me, one man, work. I was installing a structure bedecked in corporate advertising at some dreadful modern art gallery, devoid of any beauty or technical finesse. It was a perfect vignette from a civilization on the way out. Within this capitulation is a failure of responsibility to ourselves, each other, and the dignity of a meaningful job well done, all stemming from a total absence of community, and with it any kind of reasonable context into which one's work is meant to fit. When I look back on my career, I remember fondly the trees I planted, not the glass and steel monstrosities I worked on, which have wrecked the London skyline. I was lucky enough to learn from the last cohort of old-timers, and I know how drastically things have changed. There was a sense of looking after each other, of informal collective bargaining, of the ability to have an adult conversation with management about the way things ought to be. There was more danger, but the risks were visible, and we took them seriously. They were a challenge to overcome, which bred camaraderie. In short, there were men, and I learned as much from them as in my academic education. They are all gone now. Ultimately, though, they let this happen, and so did I. These last bastions of masculinity collapsed into apathy before the rest of the world did. The bureaucrats claim that they are going to build back better, but if my experience is anything to go by, this will be the equivalent of the annual January Health and Safety Blitz, little more than a hollow corporate initiative, an oxymoron if ever I heard one. These people are totally out of touch with reality and devoid of ideas. Despite the grandiose language, they are simply hanging on, determined only to manage the decline, attempting to distract us with infantilizing TED Talk propaganda. We are not all in this together. We are not even on the same team. If they were such great leaders, they wouldn't need to exert this level of control. They would inspire us. They would ask for our loyalty, not demand our conformity. But then it is obvious that they have never built anything of value in their lives. How could they? In their world, nothing can escape the flaccid grasp of bureaucracy. This cadre of financial sorcerers, billionaire surveillance moguls, and political whores know only one thing: parasitic control. Everything they create is geared towards this end. They are the Cordyceps unilateralis of the human realm, cousins of the famous zombie ant fungus. Virility, purpose, independence. All of these things represent an existential threat to their dominion. They lie beyond the horizon and are, ultimately, the reason why we must all be locked inside.